This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today's list is inspired by the fact that Amonkhet Remastered will soon be out on Magic Arena. This is an MTG Arena only set that consists of cards printed in both Amonkhet block sets, those sets being Amonkhet and Hour of Devastation. The introduction of Amonkhet Remastered means cards originally printed in this block will become legal in Historic, so this list will help highlight some of the cards likely to make an impact in that format. Reprints were not eligible to be included on this list. A card had to be originally printed in one of the two Amonkhet sets to be included, and that means that Magma Spray and Aven Mind Sensor, for example, were not eligible. In all, that means there were 464 cards that were eligible, and in this video we'll talk about the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, as well as Legacy or Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix or Magic Fest top 8 is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is Commit to Memory. One of the mechanics of Amonkhet was Aftermath, which was a new take on split cards. You can cast the first half of the card from your hand, and only from your hand, in this case that's Commit, and the Aftermath half can only be cast from your graveyard, in this case Memory. The Commit half is the biggest draw of the card as it gives you the ability to time ebb spells or non-land permanents, and that's a pretty nice and flexible effect at instant speed. Memory is no joke either, as you can use it in the later game in a situation where you have fallen really behind your opponent on cards. If you do that, you'll find that you and your opponent are back on even footing in terms of cards, and it can also mess with graveyard stuff your opponent is trying to do. This saw a lot of play in standard control decks during its time there. It was a meta with plenty of graveyard action, so the Memory half was even well positioned in the format. So far, it has only managed points in standard. At number 9, I have included two cards, On-Crop Crasher from Amonkhet and Earthshaker Kenra from Hour of Devastation. I put them together for two reasons. They are, first of all, similar cards. They're both aggressive, hasty creatures that are red that make something unable to block when they attack. Second, they have an identical score, and the two of them were played together in red aggro decks, which is why that score is identical. Each of them also showcases a different Amonkhet block mechanic. The Crasher comes with Exert, an effect many creatures in the format have that causes them to not untap on the subsequent turn in exchange for some type of effect. The Crasher makes it so a creature can't block when it is exerted, and it has haste, so it was frequently exerted the turn it came down to get a blocker out of the way in order to let the rest of your board rumble. Earthshaker Kenra, meanwhile, has the Eternalize mechanic. This allows you to pay mana for it in the graveyard in the later game, and it comes back as a 4/4 zombie token copy of itself. Obviously, the increased size on the Kenra means that it can make even more creatures incapable of blocking. These two played a big role in making mono-red aggro decks great in Amonkhet Standard, though as we'll see as we move up this list, this block had a ton of great red cards. So far, these two only have points in Standard, but they are seeing some play in Pioneer red deck wins, and could gain points there, or perhaps in Historic in the future. At number 8, it is Ramunap Ruins, which is part of a cycle of uncommon deserts from Hour of Devastation. Deserts were another mechanical aspect of Amonkhet block, with several deserts being printed, as well as several desert payoffs. Ramunap Ruins and the other cards in its cycle are both. Ramunap Ruins might not look like anything special at first glance, but its ability to sacrifice deserts for damage was great in red aggro decks. The desert you sacrifice can be Ramunap Ruins, or it can be another one you have in play. The fact that Ramunap Ruins is repeatable, provided you have those extra deserts lying around, makes it very powerful. This gives serious reach to red decks and gives them a way to finish opponents off, even if they manage to stabilize. Ramunap Ruins was such a key part of mono-red decks in Standard that the deck was usually called Ramunap Red. It was so good, in fact, that it had to be banned out of Standard because red decks in the format were performing far too well. It has gone on to find success in Pioneer in very similar red aggro decks. It will be interesting to see whether or not Ramunap Ruins is reprinted in Amonkhet Remastered, or if they are too concerned about what it could do to the historic format. At number 7, it is the Scarab God. As a block inspired by ancient Egypt, there are several gods in these two sets. Hour of Devastation features 3 multicolored gods, with the Scarab God being the only one of the 3 to make the list. Like a lot of gods, the Scarab God is very pushed. In addition to being a 5-mana 5/5 that returns to your hand if it dies in most cases, it can also exile creatures from graveyards to make eternal versions of them, and that's stupid good. But on top of that, the Scarab God also helps you scry and makes your opponent lose life the more zombies you have in play. That's a lot of crazy powerful text packed into one card. The Scarab God was one of the more dominant cards around while it was in Standard, where it was a very powerful win condition for control decks. They could kill and counter creatures all game long until they played the Scarab God and started turning those same creatures they killed or countered into 4/4 zombies, and then ran away with the game. It has also been played in Pioneer, where it's gained points in both Niv Mizzet Reborn and Dimir Inverter decks. It has 1 point in Modern 2 from Grixis Control. It is likely to gain more points in Pioneer in the future, even with Dimir Inverter decks being banned, and I don't think Modern is entirely safe from the Scarab God either. At number 6, it is Censor. One of the key mechanics of Amonkhet block was cycling, and Censor is a good example of that. Cycling is always a really interesting mechanic because adding it to subpar cards powers them up considerably in some cases, especially when it only costs a single mana to cycle. With Censor, you have a 2-mana Force Spike. That's not something that's going to see play in Constructed, but by adding cycling for 1 blue mana to it, you end up with a card that has amassed 56 points across 3 formats, and it comes in at number 6 on a list of the best cards from Amonkhet block. That's a big upgrade. The reason cycling makes a card like this so much better is because the card becomes far more flexible. Counter magic is very rigid, even on good examples of counter magic, in the sense that you have to have mana up at the right time for them to do anything. Censor is even worse than that because it lets people get out of having their spell countered by only paying a single mana, something they'll be able to do increasingly easily as the game goes on. Generally, Censor is really bad by the late game, and you just won't get to use it. All of the downsides on a card like Censor go away, though, when you add cycling, as it just lets you throw the card away for a new one in situations where it doesn't do you any good. All of that also means that running Censor in your deck is not a liability anymore, and you can still hold on to it in the early games to mess up your opponent's plan. In short, you get all the benefits of running a cheap but narrow counterspell, and you don't have to deal with the downsides because of cycling. All of that allowed Censor to gain points in multiple formats. In Standard, it was played at first in energy decks, and when that deck got banned into Oblivion, it made the transition into control decks like Jeskai, Grixis, Dimir, and Izzet. In Pioneer, it's been played in both Blue-White Control and Dimir Inverter. It also has a single point in Modern so far, coming in a wacky deck called Walks, which was a blue deck loaded up with Time Walk effects. It's been played elsewhere in Modern too, but that's the only deck it has points in so far. Censor looks to be in a good place to continue to accumulate points, but most of the 5 cards ahead of it are doing the same, so it may be at number 6 for the foreseeable future. At number 5, it is Hazaret, the Fervent, the second god to make the list. Hazaret is part of a cycle of monocolored gods from Amonkhet, and is the only member of that cycle to make this list, and also the only member of that cycle to survive in the storyline for Amonkhet. Hazaret gives you a 4-mana 5/4 with haste and indestructible, but can't attack or block unless you have 1 or fewer cards in your hand. The good news is, Hazaret helps you meet that requirement by having an activated ability that lets you damage your opponent by discarding cards from your hand. Between that ability and its size and how hard it is to kill, Hazaret can represent huge amounts of damage. It gained most of its standard points in aggressive red decks, as those are generally the decks that seek to empty their hand quickly. It managed to continue to find success even after Ramunap Ruins was banned, putting up points in Rakdos aggro decks. It has also been played in other formats. In Modern, it has 4 points, spread across decks like Jund, Affinity, and Hollow One. It has a single point from a Pioneer Wizards deck as well, and it has 1 point in Legacy in Dragon Stompy. Hazaret seems likely to gain more points in Pioneer and perhaps Historic, and maybe Modern and Legacy going forward. At number 4, it is Soulscar Mage, yet another aggressive red card. It also showcases one of Amonkhet's themes that we haven't really talked about yet, and that's -1/-1 counters. It is mostly concentrated in black-green, but as you can see, red has a bit of it as well. Soulscar Mage comes with the prowess mechanic, something that pairs incredibly well with red aggro decks that like to run burn spells you can play at instant speed. This makes the mage hit harder and also makes it more challenging to block. On top of that, the -1/-1 counter upgrade to your spells that damage creatures is great because it's usually enough to make the Soulscar Mage win in combat, especially with the addition of prowess. The Mage was played heavily in Standard its entire time there, and has a whopping 70 points in that format. It was played in Ramunap Red, but like Hazaret, transitioned to other red decks after that deck was banned. It also sees play in Modern, where it's been featured in both Phoenix decks and Prowess deck wins. Soulscar Mage is off to a pretty hot start in Pioneer too, already having 4 points in the new format. At number 3, it is Glorybringer, which is, another red card. Glorybringer has Exert, and the trigger it has is super powerful, doing 4 damage to a non-dragon creature, which was often enough for the Glorybringer to operate as a repeatable removal spell that also damages your opponent. The cost of that is that it doesn't untap for a turn, of course, so it isn't always something you want to do, but the fact that Glorybringer has the Exert ability and haste means it can often come down and immediately kill something, drastically reshaping the board. Once it's done that, it's pretty hard for you to not come out ahead of your opponent. While it wasn't Standard, Glorybringer was pretty much a staple for red decks, and it was one of the most played cards in the entire format. Unlike the red cards we've looked at so far, Glorybringer wasn't only played in more aggressive decks, it was played in mid-range and control decks too. It also has a couple of points in Modern, from Jund and Temur aggro decks. Glorybringer may not be done yet either. While it doesn't have any points in Pioneer yet, it is being played in that format, and it seems likely to pick up points there in the future. At number 2, I have most of the cycle of rare dual lands from Amonkhet. I say most because Scattered Groves actually only has 7 points and would not have made the list. Meanwhile, the other 4 have an average score of 103 and would have all made this list at number 2. These lands, commonly called bicycle lands, because they involve the number 2 a lot and also have cycling. The number 2 shows up when looking at the number of land types, the 2 kinds of mana it can tap for, and how much they can be cycled for. When talking about Censor, I mentioned how nice cycling is to have on a card that loses its viability in the late game, and that's pretty much true with lands too. If you flood out and don't need another land and you draw one of these, you can just pitch them and draw a new card. The fact that they have 2 land types means fetch lands can grab them too. All of this has led to them all, except poor Sheltered Groves, gaining a bunch of points in Standard, along with a few points in other formats like Pioneer and Modern. And at number 1, which will come as a surprise to many, it's a Braid. I would be surprised by this too if I wasn't already surprised by Braid's massive score as a result of my top 10 on modal cards. Also, counting a Braid, 6 of the 10 slots on this list are occupied by red cards. Anyway, a Braid gives you 2 options, letting you do 3 to a creature or destroy an artifact for 2 mana, and it does not do either of those things very efficiently. But having a single card that can do both is very good, because it means you can have mainboard artifact hate that still does something against everyone else. And artifact-heavy decks are relevant in every format, so that makes a Braid an attractive option. A Braid was a staple for red decks while it wasn't Standard because it offered a reasonably efficient removal spell that could also destroy the plethora of problem artifacts in the format. While a Braid does have a ton of points in Standard, its flexibility has proven to be strong enough for non-rotating formats too. In Pioneer, it's played in several different decks: Red Aggro, Blue-Red and Soul Artifact, and Blue-Red Wizards. In Modern, it's gotten points in Through the Breach, Blue Moon, and Is It Phoenix decks. In Legacy, it's been played in Delver decks primarily, with also a few points in Canadian Threshold, Reanimator, and Show and Tell, and it even has points in the most powerful format of them all, Vintage. A Braid is still actively putting up points at a high rate and has a big lead, so I don't imagine it will lose its spot on this list anytime soon. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the almost 300 of these I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.